seen anything like this in my lifetime.
It wasn't a fire, it was a storm. It was a firestorm.
Scenes which have been described as apocalyptic and unprecedented.
It is a sobering reminder of what's around the corner.
So listen up, Australia, because it's time to talk about the weather.
Australia in recession, the most critical budget of our time, what it holds and what it means for you. From 7:30, the Treasurer's speech, then all the interviews and expert analysis in the ABC News Budget Special. Budget Night 2020, October 6 on ABC and iView.
These Australians have all risen to success.
Where does that drive for excellence come from?
Join Kurt Fernley to discover how they've realised their dreams.
What's the bottom of that mystery?
I live the best life.
I dreamed of doing this and I'm doing it.
Stream the complete series of Kurt Fernley's 1+1 now on iView.
Our life is better with him in it.
I love you.
You go home and you hope their family doesn't get COVID from you.
I'd still be paying the $9,000 if I hadn't contacted 730.
We're not in the business of spreading a virus.
Why do you think they didn't want you to win an election?
Because they thought I would win it.
If the virus doesn't get you, the economic fallout will.
I was hell-bent on proving people wrong.
Why all the secrecy?
Lee, I'm just focused on the Australian people.
7:30 tonight, ABC and iView.
This is an Olympic finals night. You can absolutely taste it in the air.
Freeman. Stream now on ABC iView.
City has been in lockdown.
Good evening. It's Tuesday, the 22nd of September. Our top stories tonight. Boris Johnson will today announce new restrictions after warning thousands more may die from coronavirus. Former real estate tycoon who criticised Xi Jinping given 18 years jail over corruption charges. Renewables take a back seat as the federal government unveils its multi-billion-dollar energy policy. While Prince Charles calls for a military-style response to combat climate change.
I can see no other way forward but to call for a Marshall-like plan for nature, people and planet.
You're watching The World. Later, solving the mystery behind the tragic deaths of hundreds of Botswana elephants. Well, the World Health Organization is warning of a serious situation unfolding in Europe and a scenario where this second wave of coronavirus infections will be far worse than the first. It's already evident in France. On Saturday, it recorded its highest daily rise in cases since the pandemic began. Several other European countries are seeing figures well in the thousands each day. Health experts now expect European leaders to once again reimpose restrictions on public life. That reality will become clearer later today in the UK when the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson announces new measures to repel a second wave there. It comes after Britain's chief scientific advisor warned there could be 50,000 new cases a day by mid-October and more than 200 deaths a day by mid-November. Prime Minister Johnson spoke in the House of Commons a short time ago.
In the last fortnight, daily hospital admissions in England have more than doubled. Tens of thousands of daily infections in October would, as night follows day, lead to hundreds of daily deaths in November, and those numbers would continue to grow unless we act. And as with all respiratory viruses, COVID is likely to spread faster as autumn becomes winter. Yesterday, on the advice of the 4 chief medical officers, the UK's COVID alert level was raised from 3 to 4, the second most serious stage, meaning that transmission is high or rising exponentially. So this is the moment when we must act. If we can curb the number of daily infections and reduce the reproduction rate to 1, then we can save lives, protect the NHS and the most vulnerable, and shelter the economy from the far sterner and more costly measures that would inevitably become necessary later on. So we're acting on the principle that a stitch in time saves 9. The government will introduce new restrictions in England, carefully judged to achieve the maximum reduction in the R number with the minimum damage to lives and livelihoods. I want to stress that this is by no means a return to the full lockdown of March. We're not issuing a general instruction to stay at home. We will ensure that schools, colleges and universities stay open.
That was Boris Johnson a short time ago in the House of Commons. Our London Bureau Chief Samantha Hawley joins us out of London. Sam, they've gone now to alert level 4. How tough are these new restrictions expected to be?
Well, as you heard Boris Johnson say there, it's not another national lockdown yet, but he is urging people now to follow these new rules, which he did just announce in the House of Commons. He'll also address the nation this evening via a television address. Now, what we're seeing here is a reversal. The government here has gone from telling people to go back to the office. Boris Johnson is now saying if people can work from home, they need to work from home. Bars and pubs, restaurants will now need to shut at 10 p.m. That's another new restriction. Also, there will have to be table service. People will have to now start wearing masks as well within the restaurant, within the bar, other than when they're seated and they're eating and they're drinking. Masks will also now have to be worn in taxis, for instance. They'll need to be worn by retail workers, so a widening of the mask rules, I think you'd say. Other measures too include that businesses will face much tougher fines if they're not so-called COVID safe, so they're not sticking to the guidelines. Less people are now allowed to go to weddings. There'll be no spectators at sports still. That was meant to come into place, trials of that in early October. That's no longer going ahead anymore. So there's various new rules there. And I think the interesting point that Boris Johnson made during that address a very short time ago in the House of Commons is that these restrictions will last for another 6 months. But if the government can't get the R rate down to 1, it's above 1 now, that's the reproductive rate of the virus, then there could be more to come. So really he's putting the onus back on the public, saying these are the new rules, please stick to these rules. If we can get it down to 1, these rules will last for 6 months. If we can't get it down to 1, there will be more restrictions to come.
Sam, what is your sense of the unity within the government on these tougher measures, particularly as there are warnings the whole health system could be overwhelmed if these numbers keep rising the way they are?
Well, I think there's been quite a bit of disquiet within government ranks. There's a number of MPs that have spoken out, sort of declaring Boris Johnson a dictator. He's running a dictatorship. He's not getting approval, I think, from the Parliament in relation to measures that he's introducing. And of course, there is a very fine balance, Bev, that Boris Johnson has to strike because, of course, he wants to save lives, but also the economy. And this country's in a deep recession already. Another national lockdown, people are warning, some MPs say, would be far worse for the health of the nation and to deaths than basically coronavirus. So they don't want to see any more restrictions placed. Now, he has said during that address that he is willing to take these measures to the Parliament for debate next week. So that might appease some people. But of course, people are split on this, whether or not restrictions are the right way to go or whether or not the economy should stay fully open.
Now, we know Europe was kind of the beginning of the spread and it was very serious in the beginning, but the WHO is warning that this second wave could be worse. Which countries are the hardest hit at the moment?
Well, that's right. And I mean, you've got to remember too, Bev, that the UK is about 2 to 3 weeks behind Europe in terms of those infection rates. And that's why the scientists are looking across the channel, having a look at what's happening there and then predicting that that could also happen here, which is very concerning. Now, the worst countries at the moment in Europe, all across Europe, the infection rate is going up, but the worst nations at the moment are Spain, very concerning there. The infection rate every second day has been up at around 10,000 a day. We've seen some more restrictions put in place in Madrid in the last few days, much to the frustration of the community there. The Czech Republic is actually faring very badly at the moment as well. They've had a huge spike in cases given that they were doing quite well, actually, at the beginning of the pandemic. And then we've got France. So just to put that into context, because it's a bit difficult to understand, but 300 per 100,000 people have COVID-19 in Spain, for instance. Now, that number's 193 in the Czech Republic, that's per 100,000, and 180 in France. Now, at the moment, in the UK, it's sitting at around 69 per 100,000, but of course the fear is that that will rise and rise very quickly in the weeks ahead.
Now, ironically, Sweden has been criticised for not going into a lockdown now. It seems to be the one country in Europe that is not going through a second wave.
Well, that's right. I mean, and obviously the scientists there are pointing to the fact that they think they may be reaching a herd immunity. They haven't seen a big spike as we've seen in other countries, but I guess there's also people that would be urging, predictions to wait because we're not at the end of the pandemic yet. And of course, Sweden did have, in relation to other Nordic nations, a very high death toll. So that's another thing to take into account. But yes, so far we haven't seen that big spike that we have seen in Spain, France and elsewhere. The point that Boris Johnson made in the House of Commons just a moment ago as well was herd immunity here, you're nowhere near it. Only 8% of the population has had COVID-19, so there are many, many, many people who are very susceptible to this disease, Bev.
Sam Hawley in London, thank you so much for that update. Well, the former chairman of a state-owned real estate company who publicly criticised the Chinese government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic has been sentenced to 18 years jail. Ren Cho-chiang has been convicted of corruption, bribery, embezzlement and abuse of power. He disappeared from public view in March after publishing an essay online calling President Xi a clown who had stripped off his clothes and insisted on being an emperor. Chinese officials say Mr. Ren will not appeal the decision. Taiwan's president has visited a military base in one of its outlying islands following a recent show of force by China. Tsai Ing-wen addressed roughly 100 Air Force pilots during her tour of the airbase. In recent days, China's Air Force has flown dozens of aircraft over the Taiwan Strait as a high-profile US State Department envoy visited the island.
I know facing the provocations of the People's Liberation Army surrounding Taiwan is disturbing the area's peace. Everyone's duty has become heavier. But I have faith that every one of our well-trained Air Force brothers and sisters is able to carry this heavy responsibility.
China considers Taiwan part of its national territory and objects to all official contact with other countries. Well, a tropical storm has made landfall in the US state of Texas, tying a record set over a century ago. Tropical Storm Beta is the 9th named storm to make landfall in the United States this year, a number not seen since 1916. While packing winds of over 70 kilometres an hour, it is still unknown just how much rainfall the system will produce in an area already devastated by rough weather. Beta is expected to move northeast along the Texas coast over the next couple of days before weakening into a depression by the time it reaches Houston. Well, subsidies for wind and solar projects are to be sidelined in favour of hydrogen batteries and carbon capture under a shake-up of climate and energy policy. The federal government says it is pitching billions towards newer technology, but as political editor Andrew Probyn explains, some are just not convinced.
Climate and energy policy has bedevilled federal parliament for more than a decade.
Climate change is the great moral challenge.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
Its supercharged squabbles.
We'll abolish the carbon tax.
This is a national energy guarantee. Fueled election victories, been both poisonous and invigorating to political fortunes.
They are the technologies that can move the dial.
The latest policy incarnation, unapologetic in the way it picks winners. A so-called technology investment roadmap. And like any roadmap, it highlights the main attractions, 5 priority picks: hydrogen, energy storage, low-carbon steel and aluminium, carbon capture and storage, enriching soils and planting trees. Gas, wind and solar will help drive some of these technologies, but coal's not on the roadmap.
We're placing a bet on a portfolio here.
An $18 billion gamble over 10 years on emerging technologies, with a hope this taxpayer injection will spur private investment 3 times bigger.
They need alongside it an investment set of rules that give investors confidence to actually make this technology a reality.
The point about these priority technologies is we've chosen them because they can deliver big numbers.
Claiming carbon emissions would be cut by 200